This is a picture of the garden center has a garden, a long perennial garden called the Bonnie Lowenstein Garden, and an alpine concept garden out beyond the side gate. I take pictures of it. So some of the pictures you're going to see are found in that garden. I also take pictures of my own garden. It's much easier, during seasonal changes, instead of getting in and going to somebody else's yard, just take pictures of my local. I also have some pictures of other people's gardens that you're going to see. But we're going to talk about ornamentals, and I'm going to discuss it in what I would call some concepts for the first half of the talk. And you'll probably have a lot of questions. I'll try to stop occasionally so we can take some, but we can't do it with every section, or we wouldn't be here until 6 o'clock. It's a huge area if you think about it. There are 90% of the gardening books are on this kind of material that's out in the garden. The question that I'm going to have to turn, we also don't have a clicker, so I'm going to be the clicker. And ornamentals, for me, is has a strange connotation to it. It's kind of like the icing on the cake, the frill on the fabric, but really the plants we're talking about are far more important than that, and I want you to try to think about that as part of an ecosystem. Perennials, annuals, bulbs, ornamental grasses, what are they? They provide food for wildlife. They attract beneficial insects. They attract pollinators. And they provide habitat. Frequently you'll find in the larger ornamental grasses, that are very tall, feathers and nests and all kinds of things in them in the winter. So I'd like you to think about this when you're thinking about taking these plants into your garden or changing what you've got or creating a new garden. You think about how you can work with that ecosystem as best you can. And it takes a bit of time. The research on all of this, and some of it is very recent, about how the soils work and so on. But all of these plants are keys to how that system works. And of course, ornamentals are also for enjoyment. They are color. They are beauty. And I don't want to put that down.
Your microphone's working.
My microphone's working. Good. They are certainly there for us to enjoy the beauty and the complexity of that beauty in the natural world. And you get an emotional response. It calls an emotional response with people in gardens. It sounds like it's gone off again. All right, let's go through some definitions and get a little idea of what we're talking about. For those of you that aren't familiar with these plants and the categories they're in, perennials are all the soft plants that live for more than 2 growing seasons. And the bulk of them will die back to the ground in the winter and then regrow and regreen up from a root system as the seasons progress to warmer climates. A smaller population actually end up with woody stems and look sort of like shrubs. And books have hard times categorizing them. For example, the one that you're probably most familiar with is lavender. Okay, some books include lavender as a perennial, some books include it as a small shrub. The other thing about perennials is that they have been hybridized a great deal. You have what we call, when I'm using words in this talk, I will talk about the species form. And what that means is the wild form, the way in which the plant originally natively appeared, and hybridizers have taken it and have modified it and done tissue culture on it and all kinds of things, and it gives you that great huge variety that you see in a nursery that when you go in with all those pots. But there's a difference between the two of them, several differences. One of them is that if you are going to have a perennial, and for example, the clump gets really big, do you let it go to seed, or do you cultivate it a different way to increase it? When you have a hybridized perennial, the seed is not true to the parent, most of the time. So that's not true with some natives, but if you wanted to say, okay, I've got this clump and I want to make new ones, I want to collect the seed, you're going to end up with a plant that's different. The only way to increase a perennial is to divide it. You have to use an asexual form of reproduction, dig it up, split it, make two clumps instead of one. Okay? The other thing that they recently discovered, they've been doing experiments on what plants attract pollinators and beneficial insects. And these studies have been done in England and in the United States, and they consistently find that the closer to the original species form you are using, the more it attracts pollinators and beneficial insects. So that's not to say that some of the hybridized forms of them won't do it, but you really have to recognize that the closer you are to a species form, a wild form, the more that's going to act as an attractor. And there are two different kinds of ways in which plants are, new forms of plants are created. One is what I call hybridizing, when you've fed one type of pollen from one plant to another and created a new form. Another one's called selection. In other words, they have the natural, what you want to call, forms that are different, slightly different. And growers go around and they select. This is a plant that's taller than the regular, but it's a natural variation. And those are closer to the wild form, more likely to attract beneficial insects and pollinators. Okay, and so I've said in this that the species plants can be reproduced from seed, the species form, the natural form, wild form. Their seed will always produce the same thing. A hybridized plant, that seed, you may be interested to see what you've created, but it's not going to be the same as what you originally bought. And we talk about perennials also improving the soil. They've learned that shrubs, trees, and perennials all use the same kind of soil. It's a soil which tends to be higher in fungal matter, microorganisms that increase the activity of various nutrients in the soil. But during the season, the perennials, they shed cells as they grow. And at the end of the year, when you leave the plant in the ground and you cut it off to stimulate new growth, those roots over the winter have shed cells into the soil. So the perennials actually help improve the organic matter in the soil. And the other thing about perennials is that they share with other plants. One of the really interesting developments in the research about plants is learning that they communicate with one another. They don't do it like animals do by making noises, obviously, not least not that we can determine. But they send out various enzymes and substances in the soil, and they actually sometimes work together. You will find several plants in a community sharing microorganisms to fend off predators underground. And they've only learned recently how that is. And for example, that believe it or not, in the middle of a forest, they've learned that when there's a new seedling, which is surrounded by tall trees, and there's no light because the trees have blocked it out, the bigger trees send food to the seedling until it's big enough to get its own light. So they have all kinds of tests going on like this, and they're beginning to recognize that whole ecosystem in the ground is a lot more complicated. We really don't understand it very well. Okay, so I think we should think about planting in communities. This is the better garden, in my view, is not to plant plants like their graveyard headstones. Okay, we don't have a plant here, a plant there, and surrounded by mulch or whatever. We try to put them together in groups where they can support one another and look better that way too. What are annuals? Annuals are plants which complete their life cycle in one growing season. Those are the ones that you normally see in the nurseries that you put in pots, petunias and marigolds and so on, and the ones that you can also seed into the ground. Most annuals can be reproduced from seed, and even some of the hybrids will reproduce their seed will produce the same plant. So they're also fun. They're the ones which you can put in a pot, and then next season you can try a different one, or you can mix them, and they're really fun to play around with. The other thing about annuals is that they tend to have longer bloom seasons. You can buy some annuals which with some care, cutting back and refeeding them, they will bloom practically the whole summer. Perennials, on the other hand, have a tendency to only bloom for a certain period of time. Some will rebloom. Some that bloom in the spring and early summer may rebloom in the fall, but many of them have like anywhere between a 3 to 6 week bloom period, and then they stop. So the annuals are, if you've got a garden where you want some color and you want to provide seed for wildlife and you want to attract beneficial insects, the annuals fill in the gaps in those periodic periods where you don't have perennials blooming. And all of you know, if you garden here in Albuquerque, that in the middle of the summer when the temperature gets so high, lots of plants go dormant. And you don't have a lot of color, except for natives. Many of the natives, a good example is the Lardia blanket flower. It'll bloom all summer, and it's a perennial. But many of the ones that you buy in the nurseries, which are often plants which haven't been grown out here in this climate, they will go dormant. They won't die, they just won't bloom. Okay, so the annuals form a nice transition for us. What are bulbs? Bulbs are interesting creatures. You will know daffodils and tulips and hyacinths. Those are all bulbs. And what those are plants which have been developed in various climates where there have been negative growing problems, such as, for example, the Mediterranean, where there are sometimes in the summer there's no rain at all for 3 months. And in the winter, that's when all the rain forms. And so what have these plants done? They developed storage organs, and they often are thickened leaves or stems or parts of stems or roots, and they have become what we call bulbs. A true bulb, the word bulb is used collectively to mean all of these creatures. A true bulb, which is only a subset of that, is a rounded form with usually a tip, a tight tip, and then a circular area on the bottom that is with root system forms. And it's like an onion. It has these thickened shell-like things on the outside that you can peel off like an onion. A corm, which is a flattened, thick, and it's actually a base of a stem, and that's what crocuses and gladiolas are. You have a rhizome, which looks like a piece of ginger. I don't know if you've ever seen French ginger. It's kind of woody and it's sort of curly, and that's a typical bearded iris bulb. and a tuber, a swollen stem or root. The key things about these swollen organs that you plant in the ground and they flower, many of them in the springtime, is that they are storage organs. And what that means is they hold water and food, and when the plant starts to grow from the ground in the spring, it's drawing on the nutrients that it's got in that bulb or that root. And in order to make the bulb continue to come back, when it finishes flowering, it's got these green leaves. The green leaves start to die, and they turn yellow and then brown, and what is happening is that bulb is withdrawing the nutrients back from the leaves, which have been photosynthesizing with the sun, and restoring the food and the water that is in them. So the key about bulbs is you do not cut those leaves off until they are brown, and you can pull them off with a gentle tug. And in our climate, particularly in our growing conditions, our soil is not that rich in organic matter. And that means that it's harder for the bulb to get enough food, so he probably needs a dose of bulb food. Usually you give it to them when they first come out of the ground in the spring, a handful of bulb food, and there's Dutch bulb food, and there's organic bulb foods, and you just give them a sprinkle of that, and they will come back. They're also the first flowers to bloom in the spring. How many of you have seen any bulbs coming up right now? What do you got? Hyacinths. Yes. Daffodils. Yes. Also, crocus, right. And the beginnings of what are called snow iris. Have you ever seen those tiny irises? They're mountain irises. They're about that tall, and they are bright blue, and they come up right now in March. And they're blooming right now if you have them.
Do they look like the Dutch iris?
No, they're not related. They're actually a mountain plant. Come from parts of the European mountains, and they're called Iris reticulata, and then there's a couple of other varieties, and they're frequently seen in alpine ones. But in Albuquerque, we are in the mountains, and it's got the right climate for them. They do need some water to continue to grow every year, but they are very beautiful little things, and they will multiply over time. And here's just a couple of things. Speaking of wild forms, one of my loves is looking at some of the wilder forms of bulbs, and what is surprising is many of these smaller bulbs do very well in xeriscapes in New Mexico. On the left, you'll see a tiny daffodil. That's not more than 6 inches high. And those will perennialize, they'll continue to come back and make clumps. But you can put those in a xeriscape where you may not be giving water more than, I don't know, once every 8 days in the summertime, if you do it right. And they will come back. Dutch iris, believe it or not, will also work in xeriscapes because they originally are a cross between the Spanish iris and some other ones. On the right is a bearded iris, but this is a particular love of mine. This is that Iris pallida. It's a cross of a bearded iris, and I grow it for its foliage as well as its flower. It's a beautiful yellow and green form, and it's coming up right now, and you often will see it growing next to daffodils when they're in bloom, and they're really pretty together. And those striped leaves will last you the whole summer. They do not die back the way regular bearded iris do. They do well here. This is the Bonnie Lowenstein garden. It sure is not, the focus is not the best. Last summer, one of our master gardeners took a picture of it when all the bulbs were blooming, and you can see there were various types coming up.
And what I listed here are the other things I like, which are wild tulips and hybrids of wild tulips. Some of them are called radii tulips, wisterii, and other early tulips, and we'll see some more of those. And there's this material, by the way, that I'm going to show you. There's no way I'm going to go through this in detail. I'm not going to sit here and list all the bulbs and how deep you plant them. So if this is online, I really encourage you to look at what's there and get some of this detail. Like, for example, I have a list of books at the end, and we're going to have lists of self-seeding plants. But the general rule of thumb about planting bulbs is that they go down and they have to be planted as deep as 3 times the width of the bulb. So if you have a daffodil, which is a big bulb, it's maybe that big, you have to plant it almost a foot or 18 inches below the soil. A wild tulip may have a bulb like that, and it's only going to go down 4 or 5 inches. The one exception is rhizomes. Rhizomes and such as the bearded iris, they have to be planted close to the surface of the soil. What's an herb? We tend to use that term. It's actually not a botanical term. It's really a term about how plants have been used. And usually we call something an herb when it has an additional medicinal use. It may be a culinary, use it cooking. It could be an aromatic, and it's a cluster of plants, many of which are these soft stem plants, but it also includes shrubs. I use the example of a rose bush. That is an herb, believe it or not. It is used in cooking. It produces medicinal hips. It's used to make flavoring for baking. Rose water. Have you ever heard of that? And of course, perfume. And they used to scatter the rose leaves on I'm sure you've heard this during the Middle Ages on the floor, because nobody got washed, and they didn't sweep out the dwellings very well, so they would throw herbs and rose leaves, dried rose petals on the floor so that it would tolerate the smell. Biennials are another type that is really a subset of annual, or a cross halfway between an annual and a perennial. And a biennial is a plant which has 2 growing seasons. It lives through 2 growing seasons. The first season usually it produces a rosette of leaves, and the second year it blooms. Many of them are self-seeding. We have one that we grow in the Bonnie Lowenstein garden, which is a verbascum or a mullen that gets 6 feet tall, and every year we have a rosette that gets bigger and bigger, and then the second year we get this big tall candelabra with yellow flowers. Ornamental grasses. Now this is a category. I used to give this ornamental lecture, and I've never really expanded on this side yet, but I decided it was time to add them because you see them everywhere. Ornamental grasses are essentially a variety of grass which has been cultivated for its ability to act like a ornament rather than something to walk on, like a lawn. You see them all around our medians, usually the Carl Forester grass, that's the skinny grass with the sort of brownish tips, or something more, you see pampas grasses in your neighborhoods. And this is really a product of a very different form of garden design, which has been developing over the last 20 to 30 years. People have moved away from this cultivated, clipped sense of a garden where you take plants out and put plants in during the season, and developed more towards a relaxed, more naturalistic style that resembles a prairie. Or a cross between a prairie and a cottage garden. Ornamental grasses have been keys to that, and it's been an essential element of that kind of design. And you will see that when you get them in your garden, if you are careful about choosing them, they really are a great thing to have, because in the winter particularly, they really are lovely to look at, and they sway in the wind, and the birds and other animals really like them. And they don't have a lot of care. You really only have to, right now, in fact, is the time to cut them back. Ornamental grasses are cut back in February and March, and then they just probably, some of them will need some water, some may not need less water. You don't feed them, and they're fine. And of course, they provide habitat. I just mentioned a few of them here that you see around frequently. You will see a small bluegrass occasionally in gardens that's called a fescue, a blue fescue. The big problem with them is that if you don't get the right one, they self-seed and you get them everywhere. The one that I have up here, Elijah, is sterile, so it doesn't do that. Little blue stem, purple love grass, the medium size, the pink grass that you see in the fall around town, pink muley. The blue oak grass is one of my favorites. It's a like a blue fescue, it's much bigger, and all of these, both the fescue and the oak grass bloom early in the summer, so that you have the blooms on it for almost 10 months out of the year. The tall ones are the miscanthus or the eulilia grass. They're very tall arching. They can be 5 or 6 feet tall. The giant sacaton, which is a native, and we have it out in the Bonnie Lowenstein Alpine Garden. I think it's a really good substitute for pampas grass, and it needs water like once every 2 weeks, at the most, and not at all in the wintertime. Switchgrass, big blue stem, giant feather grass.